Hey everyone, this is a quick, maybe not so quick, video lecture for chapters 3 and 4 on research and perspectives in community psychology. Hopefully you found the introductory couple chapters of the book easy to understand, straightforward. As we're getting into some more difficult content, I wanted to do some accompanying video lectures to clarify some terms, give a few more real-world examples. For one, for the heck of it makes it more interesting, and two, to help get you thinking for your final project. And three, also, of course, to invite you to always email if you have any questions about any of our content. Don't worry, this is not for you. I'm also teaching statistics this semester and was doing lectures for them. But if I take this down, you see how messy my basement is from the kids doing their Kiwi boxes. And if this doesn't make you want to take statistics with me, then I don't know what will. So, all right. So research and perspectives in community psychology, chapters 3 and 4. Now I'm going to go a little bit backwards from how your textbook did. I'm going to do chapter 4 first and then chapter 3. Your textbook uses chapters 3 to cover perspectives and theories and important things to keep in mind when doing community psychology research. And then chapter 4 is used to actually talk about the research methods. For me, it makes more sense to think about that backwards and to start with discussing the research methods. That way, when we talk about the things that are important to community psychology, we can identify, okay, so this research method would go well towards this goal, things of that nature. So first and foremost, if you've taken a research methods class, some of this will be a review. If you haven't, I'll try to explain it in a way that you won't totally be lost. So whenever we embark on community psychology research, one of the big differences is the element of researcher control. In most elements of behavioral sciences research, I, as a researcher, am trying to eliminate confounding variables. A confounding variable is something that might be getting in the way of my explanation of the relationship between variable 1 and variable 2. A lot of cultural artifacts, community artifacts, things of that nature can fall as confounding variables. And so in a lot of the behavioral sciences, the researcher wants to eliminate those confounds or use statistical methods to control for them. But a lot of times in community psychology research, we're actually wanting to acknowledge that those confounding variables, and those become a huge part of our research. We're acknowledging them. We are giving the explanations for different things going on in the community that within the community culture that may be affecting our research and that may be affecting our findings. So let's start with talking about research methods in community psychology with chapter 4, because I want you to see the actual methods and then understand how those link back to the goals of community psychology. I'm not going to sit here and summarize both chapters in your textbook. I feel like a lot of things were explained very clearly. Like I said, I just want to elaborate some things, clarify some things, give some examples. I'm also going to throw in a couple concepts your textbook did not talk about that will end up being an extra credit option on the quiz. So you might want to take notes on a couple things because I'll ask you about them on the quiz for some bonus points. So first of all, qualitative research or quantitative research, words or numbers. We can break down statistical analyses, statistical methods into two main overarching realms, qualitative or quantitative. In qualitative statistics, we're asking people to give their narratives. We're asking them to give their personal stories. We are sitting down with people or we're on the phone. We're asking them questions, and we're allowing our questions to be shaped as we go with those individual conversations. We're not necessarily walking into it with a set survey, right? We're giving them a chance to speak. In quantitative research, we usually enter with a set number of items that we want numbers from our participants about. We want to look for trends. We want to turn things into numbers that we can analyze and work with and put in our software and do all these statistics that I'll teach you about if you take stats with me, and find some trends that we can say, I have statistically shown that this is a significant thing that's happening. So two different methods, two different goals. So I want to differentiate these a little bit further in case they were a little bit blurry from how your book explained them. In qualitative research, we are really focusing on the meanings that the participants bring to the topics. Okay, we're going to use a much smaller data set, much smaller sampling pool, because we're sitting and interviewing these participants sometimes for hours. And there's a few reasons we might want to do this over a survey. First of all, we need to ask, is this a topic that just hasn't been studied in much detail before? One example of that would be this past year, I wrote a textbook chapter for a book series, and our main goal that we were discussing was sexual violence against women in different places throughout the globe. And I wrote a chapter about Latin America, and I wrote a chapter about the Middle East. But in discussing sexual violence against women, one of the things that we also discussed in that chapter was the idea of honor killings. And I had come across this really interesting article that was about women who are foreign exchange students to somewhere in Western culture, so somewhere in Europe, somewhere in the United States or Canada, that are foreign exchange university students that end up becoming afraid to return home because there are people in their family still or people in their village still who believe in honor killings. And they are afraid that because of some aspect of how their lives went while they were in college, that there actually could be harm that came to them. There was 2 or 3 women, I think, interviewed for this article, and that was it. But I say that to say that this would be an example of this isn't really a topic that we've studied in detail before. I wouldn't be able to put together a survey to give to foreign exchange students from very conservative pockets of the Middle East in Western culture who might be afraid of going home for this reason, and even know how to make a meaningful survey about this, because we haven't heard enough of those voices yet to even know what exactly do we want to research here. So that would be an example of a situation of this is a topic that just has not been studied before in very much detail. And so we can't just go out and make some questionnaires about it. We first need to talk to more of these women and get an idea about what this phenomena is that's happening. Going hand in hand in that, there's also the idea of, is there a perspective on this topic that has not been articulated well and that needs to be given voice? Maybe it is a topic that we've researched. We just haven't researched it from the perspective of a specific population. One example that I immediately think of was in this last round of the Olympics, and I apologize, I cannot remember the athlete's name. I will make sure to look up her name so I can post it. There was a Black athlete, I believe she was a track athlete, and she medaled. And she gave an interview where she was saying that she had a really hard time being proud of it, because she was saying that even though she had been successful, that she knew that the way the athletic system in the United States was set up was not to serve people like her, was not to serve people from her community. She mentioned being raised in a very low-income family, in a very impoverished community, having a very rough childhood, adolescence, not having a lot of resources. And she was saying, this was not set up to serve me. I made it, but I have a hard time being proud of this because I feel like that this is not something that represents where I come from as a whole. Okay. And again, I give that example to say we've studied athletes, right? I mean, you can get on the journal article finder and search for college athletes, Olympic athletes. We've studied stuff about their personality, about their upbringing, about their training. Like, we've done research on athletes. We have that. We haven't really done a whole lot of research on people who would be in her similar situation of, it was very unlikely that I would succeed at this. And I kind of feel like I'm a fluke because I feel like the whole situation is not set up for people like me. We haven't really done research that has given that type of athlete a voice. And so that would be an example that we have the research on it, just not really from that perspective, that we would need to do more interviewing researchers interviewing research to get more of that kind of opinion in order to even be able to form a meaningful survey to know if we wanted to research this group. What should we ask? How should we go about doing this? So again, a lot of times it's very, very small samples so that you can get much more description, but also because you know that you're going to be working with perhaps a very detailed group that there's not a lot of people in, right? If we wanted to do research on Olympic athletes from low income, impoverished neighborhoods with difficult childhoods, we might not be able to go out and find 5,000 of them to take a survey. It might be a small handful. If we're willing to find female foreign exchange students from certain pockets of the Middle East where there are still honor killings and we might not be able to find thousands of them to survey them. We might be able to find 5 to talk to, right? So a lot of times it's very small samples, and that is okay because it is our priority to understand the meaning from them over generalization. If you've taken statistics or methods, you know that generalization is the idea of, can I take the findings of my study and apply it to other people? So we're not really as concerned about that with qualitative research. We're more concerned about, I got enough detail from the people I am studying to fully understand their meaning of the situation. Now, quantitative research, on the other hand, is we're interested in numbers. We're doing a numerical analysis. We want to be able to have statistical control, and we want to be able to find trends and make comparisons. I want to be able to say, these kids are more likely than these kids to fill in the blank. This type of neighborhood is less likely than this type of neighborhood to whatever. So anytime I'm wanting to make those comparisons to state cause and effect or to find a relationship, I'm wanting to do quantitative research. So are we wanting to find and analyze similarities and differences? Are we wanting to predict an outcome or be able to say that there's a cause and effect relationship? Are we wanting to compare different contexts, right? Maybe I want to compare bullying in private religious schools versus public schools. I need a big group of students from both types of schools to be able to do the statistics to compare them. Are we wanting to find patterns? And to do all this, we need large samples. We need a lot of people. I need to be able to give my survey to 1,000 different kids or 1,000 different community members. I need a lot of numbers so that I have the statistical power to make the comparisons I'm wanting to make. And a lot of times with quantitative research, not always, we'll get to this, but a lot of times with quantitative research, I want generalizable findings. Your book gave the example of looking at high schools that have a gay-straight alliance and the effect on students that identify as LGBTQ, right? I want to be able to know that I've gotten enough variety of students that if I do this research, it doesn't just apply in the 1, 2, or 5 schools that I looked at, but I could maybe make some general statements about here's the impact of GSAs that a high school in Seattle could get just as much use out of as a high school in El Paso. So, and obviously, again, cultural differences, and we'll get to all of this. But the idea being, I want to find some generalizable data. Both of these are very useful, and both of them have a place in community research. One is not better than the other. They're just useful for different types of research. So some key terms and quick clarifications. When we're talking about research, it's very clear that we keep straight correlation versus causation. There only being a relationship between something does not mean that there is a cause and effect between something. If I have determined that there is a relationship, to go back to the GSA example, just because your textbook refers back to it several times. If I've determined that there is a relationship between a GSA at a school and a low rate of bullying of LGBTQ students at that school, I'm saying there's a relationship. I'm not saying the GSA caused a low level of bullying. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe there was already a very low level of bullying, a very high level of acceptance of these students, and that's why a GSA was approved to even form. at that school. So maybe the relationship works the other way. When I have something that's a correlation, I cannot say cause and effect. I can make some guesses about it. I can propose some explanations, but I can't say cause and effect. For a cause and effect relationship, I have to do a true experiment or quasi-experiment. So make sure you keep those two things straight. The other important terminology that we will return to quite a bit throughout this semester is incidence versus prevalence. Incidence is the number of new occurrences, and incidence and prevalence can only be determined with quantitative research, right? We need statistics, we need numbers. Incidence is the number of new occurrences or new cases of something. Prevalence is the number of existing occurrences. A lot of times if I'm working with prevention research, I'm really interested in incidence. How many new cases am I getting each year, each month? Because that's going to show me if some of my prevention efforts are working. If I'm interested in overall community aid or community intervention, I don't really care when the cases started. I'm more concerned with there's this number of cases currently within the community, and we need to try to get that number down. Another question that a lot of researchers ask is, do we do qualitative research and then quantitative, or quantitative then qualitative? And there's benefits to both. And the right answer is actually both. You do qualitative research, as we talked about examples a little bit earlier in the lecture, to know what are we researching and why. How do I even shape my survey? What questions do I need to ask for my quantitative data? But a lot of times doing qualitative research as a follow-up and getting some additional meaning from those participants can help us make sense of the numbers. And I'm going to give you an example from some research that I was involved in. We did, and this unfortunately did not get published due to some statistical methodology stuff with our response rate, and that's a whole separate issue, but it does not take away from the example. The research team had looked at couples who were Latter-day Saints, who were Mormon. And we were asking them about their communication with each other within their marriage, their relational communication. And we were looking at their shared religious activities. Did they go to church together? Did they do devotions together? Did they pray together? Things like that. And we found this really interesting relationship that there were very high levels of functional communication, like high levels of communication satisfaction within the couples that prayed together on a regular basis. Now, if that's all we had, we could make a lot of assumptions about why this relationship was there. Like the super religious couples that were praying together, there was something else going on that helped them have good communication or whatever. But we could have made a lot of potential explanations that tied it back to an element of religiosity or spirituality. But we did some qualitative follow-up questions asking what the interplay between some of these was. And what we found was that a lot of the couples mentioned that just that action of, I am recounting to my spouse the things about my day that were difficult, that frustrated me, that made me mad, that made me sad, that I'm feeling anxious about, whatever. That act of doing that on a daily basis kept channels of emotional communication open and gave them a lot of practice with putting words to their emotions and being able to express that and feeling heard by their spouse. So it wasn't actually the act of, like, the religious spiritual act of these couples praying together that was making the difference. It was that in them praying together, there was this precursor that before that happened, they were sharing emotions of their day on a nearly daily basis. And that was, and we wouldn't have known that if we wouldn't have asked those qualitative follow-ups of, help us make some connections between these things that you said. So that's an example of a time whenever you would kind of want to sandwich your quantitative research in between two sets of qualitative research. So you know what to ask, but then after you've asked it, you know how to explain it. And so that's kind of the idea of mixed methods, is you design a study where you use both. All right, now on to chapter 3. All right, so The big thing about community research is that it is contextually grounded. And your textbook breaks this down into 4 key sections: examining values and assumptions, community partnership and participation and collaboration, awareness of cultural and social context, and maintaining an ecological perspective. So, examining values and assumptions, you're wanting to discuss what is the value of this research and who can benefit. So we're not just looking at what can be learned from this research, because sure, we can learn all kinds of interesting facts about a community and statistical trends in a community. But what is the actual value that we can bring back to the community to make change? If I show that there is a really great relationship between increasing student participation in a GSA and lowering rates of student bullying, am I just going to publish that in an article that, hey, here's a super interesting statistic? Or are we going to go back into the communities and say, hey, here's a good reason why it would be important to look into maybe doing a GSA in your high schools? Another thing gets to the issue of social power, which is who has defined this problem, and are we attending to marginalized voices? Your textbook points out that giving an actual definition for what is the problem that we need to solve, a lot of times we don't even agree on that. An example that you can look at would be prostitution. What is the problem of prostitution? Is it that prostitution needs to end? This is a bad thing that should never happen? Is it that prostitution should be legalized and what we need to end is the violence that occurs towards prostitutes and like the pimp system and the trafficking system? Like, what is, if I were to stand up in a group of human sexuality professionals and say, I want to talk about the problem of prostitution, that's not a clear statement. We don't agree necessarily on what is the problem here. Same with drug use, right? You have people who want to make a lot of things recreational, that they would see the problem with drug use as the illegal trade of it, the trafficking of it, the tie of it with gangs and violence, the way it is unequally enforced, and a whole host of other issues. Yes, obviously addiction can get at dangerous levels very quickly. And then you would have other people who would define the problem of drugs in the community as the fact that they even exist, right? And these people would not see eye to eye if we were talking about the problem of drug use. So who has defined this problem and what is it being defined as? And then finally, are we attending to marginalized voices? Are we listening to people who are often not very represented in research? If I go into a community and say, I'm looking for volunteers to take my survey, I might have a problem because the people that would trust me as a researcher and be willing to step forward and participate might not be representative of some of the disempowered voices that I really want to hear from. So are we attending to marginalized voices? And your textbook does a really great job of going into quite a bit of detail on this topic. I will quickly discuss community participation because, again, your book covers it really well. But one of the big things to keep in mind is, are there any ethical challenges to the community that you're researching? If I'm doing research, to go back to an example I just gave, if I'm doing research on prostitution or drug use, is there a chance that people I talk to are going to be arrested for a crime because they talked to me? If I'm wanting to maintain relationships with people in power so that my research can maybe make a difference and help people, am I setting up a conflict of interest by maintaining a relationship with a group, an organization, a leader that maybe is perpetuating injustice towards people? So there are ethical challenges that need to be considered. And you also need to consider, what is the relationship between researcher and community? And these next two are the topics where I'm going to introduce a couple of terms that will apply for bonus points. So awareness of cultural and social contexts. My doctoral minor is multicultural psychology, so this is an area that I love discussing. Community research always occurs within culture. There is a culture of neighborhoods. There are different pockets of culture all throughout the community, spread across the US, right? Community research always occurs within culture. And the researcher must have knowledge of that culture and that community. Let's return to an example I gave earlier on in this lecture about the Black athlete who felt like professional athletics really was not representative of the type of life that she came from. Let's say I had a job at a community center that served low-income youth, and I was asked to do research on how can we get more at-risk low-income families in here to introduce their kids to sports and give them an activity that they could excel at. Let's say I was designed to research that, right? That's my job. That's now what I've been hired to research. I obviously do not have a lived experience of being a Black athlete, right? This is not my community. This is not my culture. This is not something I have experience in. So I, as a researcher, would first need to gain quite a bit of knowledge about the culture of Black athletics, about the culture, if I was in a low-income Black neighborhood, about the culture even of athletics in general, right? I was never an athlete at any sort of competitive level. These are both cultures that are very much outside of what I know. And so step one would need to be gaining knowledge and honestly putting together a team where I was not the loudest voice, since that is not a culture that I can speak from a direct standpoint. Here is bonus option one, standpoint theory. Your textbook never uses this term, which I was very disappointed in because this is an important perspective. It summarizes it basically. But so standpoint theory is a theoretical perspective that consistently reinforces that our knowledge stems from our own social position. I am going to have a cap on the level of knowledge that I can ever truly have about low-income Black athletes, because that's not my standpoint. I have never been there. Similarly, there would be a cap on the knowledge that an individual who was raised in a low-income Black neighborhood would have on understanding someone who is from a first-generation Mexican immigrant family, right? Which is my background. We can empathize with each other. We can have active dialogue. We can advocate for each other. But we're coming from very different standpoints. And so there's always going to be a cap of our knowledge, because knowledge comes from your social position. So there is your definition of standpoint theory, okay? Is that your knowledge always stems from your social position. For bonus points on this week's quiz, you'll be asked to define it and give me an example. So be thinking about that if you would like to. So that's standpoint theory. The other element of this is you always want to be mindful of the context of your research findings. If you're doing community psychology research, you never totally divorce your research findings from the context that they occurred in. And the last thing, maintaining an ecological perspective. Review page 16 about the ecological theory. Here's the second thing I want to add in, and that's mesosystem. Your textbook does not talk about mesosystem. My background is developmental psychology. I'm developmental psych and then a multicultural psych doctoral minor. So we talk about Bronfenbrenner's theory a lot with the things that I do. Mesosystem, again, I'll ask you to define it and give me an example. The mesosystem is the idea that you have your microsystems, right? But there are relationships happening between your microsystems, and those relationships also affect you. An example of this would be if I am wanting to study a school system and I'm wanting to study academic achievement of individuals inside the school system. I can look at some of those microsystems, right? I can look at a child's teachers. I can look at a child's parents and how much they encourage homework and help with homework and all that. I can look at microsystems. But an important mesosystem might be the relationship between the parents and the teachers, the parent and the school. How much is there a relationship there? Because a parent who's communicating every week with the child's teacher on something they're having issue with would create a very different scenario than a parent who met the teacher at Meet the Teacher Night and has never communicated with them throughout the entire year and isn't fully aware of where in the class their children might be struggling, their child might be struggling. So the mesosystem is the relationship between the microsystems. All right, so be able to define that and give me an example. All right, last big thing, the 3 philosophies of community psychology research: post-positivist, constructivist, and critical. Post-positivism, we recognize that no one is truly objective, no researcher is truly objective, no reader will be truly objective, but we need to be doing our research in a way that reduces our bias as much as possible. We want to control for as much context as possible so that we can clarify what the cause and effect relationship is. If I am doing research in an area in Arizona, I lived in Phoenix for a long time. If I'm doing research in an area in Arizona where there are a lot of lower income school districts that have a lot of students that are from first generation immigrant families, okay? Maybe I want to come up with a cause and effect between something about these students. And maybe I want it to be able to generalize to places also in Texas and New Mexico and California, where we would also see quite a few low-income school districts that have a lot of students from first-generation immigrant families. But I would want to be able to clarify the cause and effect and generalize across those contexts enough that I could control for some of those other variables that might be floating around. I might want to control for income. I might want to control for language prominently spoken at home, experiences of racism or discrimination, whatever. I might have a lot of things that I say, okay, I realize that this is important for your cultural context, but we're not studying that right now. So we're going to put it over here. Okay. And that's part of positivistic, post-positivism perspective. And as you can see, this yields itself very well to quantitative data, because I'm trying to find these relationships. I'm trying to find cause and effect. I'm trying to find trends. I'm trying to generalize. I want to get a wealth of knowledge about what is happening here. I'm looking for concrete, pragmatic, and widely acceptable answers. A lot of program evaluation and intervention evaluation is going to come from this perspective. We realize that our participants in our program and our intervention and our reduction efforts have a whole lot of things about their culture and their community that might be significant. We're going to figure out a way statistically to just kind of set those up here so we can focus on cause and effect. Was our intervention effective? The next perspective is constructivist. In this one, instead of trying to set aside our biases, we're discussing and evaluating our assumptions. We're entering and saying, here's where I know I'm not looking at this objectively, because it comes from the viewpoint that you can never be objective. You can never get rid of bias. You're looking to describe research relationships. So I would want to really describe what relationship did I form with the people who participated in my study, with the people that I interviewed, how much time did I spend with them, how much rapport did I build. I would always keep in mind that there's limits to my knowledge, right? This is good for qualitative data if you're interviewing, because you recognize I can't ask all the questions, or we'd be meeting for a 4-hour coffee meeting every day for 3 months, right? I can't ask all of the questions that I might want to ask. There's limits on the knowledge that I can gain about this. And it's also going to acknowledge that it's going to be hard to make long-lasting generalizable truths, because community issues and social problems are going to continue to change and evolve as communities continue to change and evolve. So you're trying to understand and study specific social contexts. So like the last example I gave, if I was looking at first generation Mexican immigrant families in low income school systems, I wouldn't take all those individual variables that might affect it and kind of put it on a shelf just to do my statistical analysis. I would bring in as many of those as I could find a way to bring into my research and be saying, but consider this part, but consider this part, but consider this part. Because I would go back to the fact that there are a lot of elements of the community that matter. And finally, the critical stance. This is exactly what it sounds like. I enter my research being critical of something, realizing that there's a problem that needs to change. Most people with a critical philosophy approach it from an activism standpoint. I have an agenda in completing this research, and that is because here's this thing that I think needs to change. I'm not just interviewing first generation Mexican immigrant families in low income school systems for the heck of it to get some interesting information. Maybe I'm doing it because I'm looking at a school system and saying, you are underserving these kids in comparison to all the other schools in the district because you know they're from low income first generation Mexican immigrant families and maybe you have a bias. So I'm entering with an agenda for activism to try to get change done. My research is going to challenge an injustice or a problem that is taking place. And in this one, we're actively acknowledging our knowledge is shaped by those in power and maintained by social institutions and belief systems. I don't know if you've ever watched the show BoJack Horseman. Highly recommend it if you have not. But there's a satire piece in it where they're talking about women's health. They're specifically talking about contraception and abortion. And they make the joke of, and now to our panel of middle-aged white men wearing bow ties to discuss women's health, right? The idea being for a long time, research on women's health was conducted and discussed not by younger adult females, but by older men, which is fine. They're research professionals, right? I don't have to, like my example earlier, if I did community research with young low-income Black athletes, I don't necessarily have to be the person that the research of my target is, that the target of my research is. I said that backwards. But the idea being, who is it that's been in power on this topic, that has been the loudest voice in this topic, that has discussed and maintained what we consider knowledge and truth about this topic. And a lot of times you trace that back to social institutions and belief systems that have been in power. Who has the power to state truth? Who has the loudest voice in defining the problem? Remember, we talked about earlier that even the definition of a problem can be an issue sometimes and an element for disagreement. Who has been the loudest voice in the room that's been defining what this problem is and how we should look at it? And who has greater and lesser degrees of social power? And then that will kind of loop back to the idea of giving a voice to marginalized populations. And which perspective we're going to use is going to guide our research questions and methods. Constructivism is often coming from qualitative methods, not always, but often. Post-positivism fits very well with quantitative. So quantitative, qualitative, and then critical can be either, because it's more about what you're trying to do with your numbers. All right, that's all I got. Bonus questions will be referenced on the quiz. Email me with questions, comments, or concerns. Thanks for watching.